The day started like any other at the bustling international airport. Travelers rushed to and fro, dragging suitcases behind them, while announcements echoed over the intercom about delayed flights and gate changes. Among the crowd was Marcus Kane, a man who looked just like anyone else trying to catch a flight home. He wore a simple pair of jeans, a dark jacket, and sunglasses perched on his head. His presence was unassuming, almost blending into the sea of faces around him. But what set Marcus apart wasn't immediately obvious, at least not to the casual observer. By his side trotted Shadow, a sleek German shepherd with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was a highly trained service animal, capable of detecting even the slightest shift in Marcus's mood or physical state. For Marcus, Shadow wasn't just a companion, he was a lifeline. After years of serving in some of the most dangerous corners of the world as a Delta Force commander, Marcus had returned home carrying invisible scars, the kind no one could see but felt deeply within. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, had become part of his life, and Shadow helped keep those demons at bay. Marcus moved through the terminal with practiced ease, his movements calm, yet deliberate. Years of military training had ingrained in him a sense of precision, even in mundane tasks like navigating an airport. As he approached the gate for his flight, he handed over his boarding pass to the attendant with a polite nod. Shadow stayed, close, sitting obediently by his feet, his leash firmly in Marcus's hand. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. Boarding the plane went smoothly enough. Marcus found his assigned seat near the middle of the cabin and settled in, making sure Shadow had enough space to lie down comfortably. Passengers filed in one by one, stowing their carry-ons and chatting quietly. A young mother struggled to buckle her toddler into the seatbelt, while a businessman tapped away furiously on his laptop. It was all so ordinary, so routine. And then she appeared, a flight attendant with a clipboard tucked under her arm and a forced smile plastered across her face. She stopped in front of Marcus and Shadow, her gaze flickering between the dog and the passenger manifest in her hands. "Sir," she began, her tone clipped, "I'm going to need you to move your pet." She emphasized the word pet as if it left a bad taste in her mouth. Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze steadily. Without saying a word, he pointed to the official badge clipped to Shadow's harness, clearly labeling him as a service animal. "I'm sorry," Marcus replied calmly, "but this is my service dog. He's certified and fully documented." His voice carried no hint of aggression, only patience. Still, the flight attendant didn't seem satisfied. She glanced around, perhaps hoping someone would back her up, before leaning in slightly closer. "Look, sir," she said, lowering her voice but failing to mask her irritation. "We have rules here. Pets aren't allowed unless they're properly registered. Now, I don't know what kind of papers you think you have, but—" Marcus cut her off gently but firmly. "Ma'am, I assure you Shadow is registered and trained. Here are his credentials." With that, he pulled out a folder containing official documents proving Shadow's status as a legitimate service animal. The flight attendant barely glanced at them, her lips pursed tightly together. Instead of backing down, she crossed her arms and let out a huff. "Well, maybe next time you'll learn to follow the rules more carefully," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Marcus and several nearby passengers to hear. For a moment, Marcus considered responding further, but he decided against it. There was no point in escalating the situation. He'd dealt with people like her before, those who judged based on appearances rather than facts. What they didn't understand was that Shadow wasn't just there for show. Every wag of his tail, every alert glance served a purpose. To dismiss him as merely a pet was not only disrespectful but potentially harmful. As the flight attendant walked away, Marcus exhaled slowly, shaking his head. He turned his attention back to Shadow, scratching behind the dog's ears. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured softly. Shadow responded with a soft whine, pressing his nose against Marcus's knee. Around them, the hum of conversation resumed, though a few curious glances lingered. Some passengers exchanged knowing looks, silently acknowledging the tension that had briefly filled the air. Despite the unpleasant encounter, Marcus tried to focus on the positives. This was supposed to be a peaceful journey home after months of grueling work overseas. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. Shadow rested his head on Marcus's foot, his breathing slow and steady. Together they formed a picture of quiet resilience, a stark contrast to the chaos that often surrounded them. Little did anyone on that plane know, including the flight attendant, that Marcus was far from an average traveler. Beneath his calm exterior lay decades of experience in some of the most high-stakes operations imaginable. He had faced enemies who would stop at nothing to harm him, survived situations that would break most people, and earned respect from allies and adversaries alike. Yet here he was, sitting quietly in a cramped airplane seat, enduring petty insults because of a misunderstanding, or perhaps something deeper. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. In his line of work, quick judgments could mean the difference between life and death. Precision mattered, intent mattered. And yet, in this civilian setting, assumptions reigned supreme. People saw what they wanted to see. A black man traveling with a large dog, surely inconveniencing everyone else. They didn't see the weight of responsibility Marcus carried daily, nor the sacrifices he'd made for his country. All they saw was someone who didn't fit their idea of normal. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Marcus opened his eyes and stared out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly across the horizon, promising a smooth flight ahead. Or so he hoped. What he couldn't predict was how much longer he'd have to endure the flight attendant's hostility, or whether she'd push things too far. For now, though, Marcus remained still, his thoughts drifting to the comfort of home and the promise of peace waiting for him once this journey ended. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Marcus tried to focus on the rhythmic hum of the engines and the soft pressure of Shadow's head resting against his leg. He had hoped the earlier confrontation with the flight attendant would be the end of it, a minor annoyance quickly forgotten as the flight progressed. But Marcus knew better than to let his guard down entirely. Years of experience had taught him that some people don't back down easily, especially when they feel challenged or embarrassed. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the tension to resurface. The same flight attendant reappeared, this time, wheeling a beverage cart down the aisle. She wore an insincere smile as she handed out drinks to passengers, her tone overly cheerful as she asked if anyone wanted coffee, tea, or soda. When she reached Marcus's row, however, her demeanor shifted. Dramatically, her smile faltered, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that made it clear she hadn't forgotten their earlier exchange. "Anything for you, sir?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Marcus glanced up, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Water, please," he replied politely, holding out his hand. The flight attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing him a small plastic cup filled halfway with water. As she did so, her foot brushed against Shadow's side. Not accidentally, but deliberately. It wasn't a hard kick, but it was forceful enough to make Shadow react. The dog's ears perked up instantly, and a low growl rumbled deep in his throat. Marcus placed a firm hand on Shadow's back, silently commanding him to stay calm. Shadow obeyed, though his eyes remained fixed on the flight attendant, who took a step back, startled by the sudden sound. For a moment there was silence in the cabin. Nearby passengers turned their heads, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and unease. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but cold. "That wasn't necessary," he said, his words cutting through the quiet like a blade. The flight attendant blinked rapidly, caught off guard by his directness. Instead of apologizing, she straightened her posture and forced another brittle smile. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, her tone laced with mockery. "I didn't realize your pet was so sensitive." The word pet hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to respond harshly. He had faced far worse insults in his life, both during combat missions and afterward. But hearing someone dismiss Shadow after all the work he'd done to train him stung more than he cared to admit. Still, Marcus reminded himself that losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. Control was everything, both in battle and in moments like these. To distract himself, Marcus glanced around the cabin. Some passengers were pretending not to notice the tension, burying their faces in books or scrolling through their phones. Others watched openly, their expressions ranging from sympathy to disapproval. A young woman sitting across the aisle met Marcus's eyes briefly before looking away, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. An older man 2 rows ahead muttered something under his breath about rudeness, though whether he meant the flight attendant or Marcus was unclear. Despite his efforts to remain composed, the encounter gnawed at Marcus. It wasn't just about the disrespect shown to Shadow, it was the underlying attitude behind it. Over the years, Marcus had grown accustomed to being judged based on appearances. People often assumed things about him because of the color of his skin or the fact that he traveled with a large dog. What frustrated him most was how little effort some people put into understanding the truth. To them, Shadow was just another inconvenience, a disruption to their otherwise perfect flight. But Shadow wasn't an inconvenience. He was a highly trained companion who had saved Marcus's life more times than he could count. There were nights when Marcus's mind spiraled into dark memories of war zones and battles fought long ago. On those nights, Shadow would nudge him awake, pulling him back from the brink of panic. During the day, Shadow acted as a buffer between Marcus and the overwhelming stimuli of crowded spaces, helping him navigate the world with a sense of stability. To reduce him to a mere pet was not only inaccurate but deeply disrespectful. As the minutes ticked by, the flight attendant continued her rounds, but her behavior toward Marcus grew increasingly hostile. Every time she passed his seat, she found a reason to linger, a dropped napkin here, a misplaced bottle cap there. Each interaction was punctuated by snide remarks or exaggerated sighs, as if she hoped to provoke him into losing his cool. Marcus ignored her, focusing instead on Shadow and the calming rhythm of the plane's engines. Passengers began to whisper among themselves, speculating about what might have happened earlier. One man leaned over to his wife and murmured, "Did you see that? That guy's dog is legit. He's got papers and everything." His wife nodded sympathetically, casting a glance at Marcus. "Poor guy," she whispered back. "She's being ridiculous." Others weren't so kind. A teenager seated nearby rolled his eyes and muttered to his friend, "Why does he even need a dog on a plane? Seems like a lot of drama." His friend shrugged, unwilling to get involved. Meanwhile, the flight attendant seemed emboldened by any perceived support, no matter how subtle. With each passing minute, her actions became bolder, bordering on outright confrontational. At one point, she stopped near Marcus's seat and loudly announced to the surrounding passengers, "For everyone's safety, please make sure your belongings and your animals are secured properly." Her emphasis on the word animals left no doubt who she was referring to. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to laugh, intervene, or simply ignore the escalating situation. Marcus felt the weight of attention pressing down on him, but he refused to rise to the bait. Instead, he focused on controlling his breathing, a technique he'd learned during countless high-pressure scenarios. Inhale, exhale, stay calm. Losing control now would only validate the flight attendant's behavior and give her the upper hand, and Marcus Kane did not give anyone the upper hand unless he chose to. Still, the constant scrutiny wore on him. He thought about the irony of the situation. Here he was, a man who had faced bullets, explosives, and enemy combatants without blinking, reduced to enduring petty jabs from someone whose biggest challenge in life was probably managing unruly passengers. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, if it weren't so infuriating. Shadow, sensing Marcus's growing frustration, pressed closer to him, offering silent reassurance. Marcus rested a hand on the dog's neck, drawing strength from the bond they shared. Together, they had conquered far greater challenges than this. They could endure a few more hours in the air, even if it meant putting up with someone who couldn't, or wouldn't, understand their reality. And yet, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The flight attendant's behavior suggested she wasn't going to back down anytime soon. If anything, she seemed determined to push the situation to its breaking point. Marcus wondered how much longer he could hold his ground before deciding enough was enough. After all, patience was a virtue, but even virtues had limits. The tension in the cabin had reached a boiling point, and Marcus could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The flight attendant's behavior had escalated from passive-aggressive comments to outright hostility, her actions becoming more brazen with each passing moment. It was as if she had decided that Marcus wasn't just an inconvenience, he was a personal affront to her authority. Every time she passed his seat, she found a new reason to criticize or belittle him, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby passengers heard every word. At one point, turbulence shook the plane, causing Shadow to shift slightly in his position. Normally, this wouldn't have been a problem. Shadow was trained to remain calm even in chaotic situations. But the movement caught the flight attendant's attention. She stopped abruptly, turning toward Marcus with a look of exaggerated exasperation. "Sir," she said loudly, drawing the eyes of everyone within earshot, "I must insist that you keep your animal under control. This is a commercial flight, not a dog park." Her tone was sharp, dripping with disdain, and the emphasis she placed on the word animal left no room for interpretation. She wasn't just talking about Shadow, she was making a statement about Marcus himself. The implication was clear. He didn't belong here, not with his dog, not in this space where people like her set the rules. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew better than to let his emotions show. Not yet, anyway. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "Ma'am," he began, his words measured and deliberate. "Shadow is perfectly under control. He's trained to handle situations far more stressful than this. If you'd like, I can show you his certification again." His offer wasn't meant to be helpful. It was a subtle reminder that she had already dismissed his credentials once before. The flight attendant scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, spare me the lecture," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "We all know how these things work. People bring their pets on planes and expect everyone else to accommodate them. It's selfish, plain and simple." As she spoke, she glanced around the cabin, as if seeking validation from the other passengers. A few avoided her gaze altogether, while others nodded hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation but unwilling to intervene. Marcus felt a surge of frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had faced countless challenges in his life or death scenarios that required split-second decisions and unwavering focus. Yet here he was, sitting in a cramped airplane seat, being lectured by someone who had no idea who he truly was or what he had sacrificed for his country. The absurdity of the situation almost made him laugh, if it weren't so infuriating. But Marcus wasn't laughing. He was calculating. Over the years, he had learned to read people, their body language, their tone, their intentions. And right now, the flight attendant's behavior screamed insecurity masked as superiority. She wanted to assert dominance, to prove that she was in charge, even if it meant humiliating someone else in the process. What she didn't realize was that Marcus had spent decades mastering the art of control. He didn't need to shout or make a scene to command respect. All he needed was the right moment and the right words. Taking a deep breath, Marcus sat up straighter in his seat, his posture radiating quiet authority. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and calm, "you've made your feelings about my service dog abundantly clear. But let me be equally clear. Shadow isn't just a dog. He's part of my medical treatment plan, prescribed by doctors who understand the realities of post-traumatic stress disorder. You may not see the scars I carry, but they're there, and Shadow helps me manage them in ways you couldn't possibly comprehend." For a brief moment, the flight attendant looked taken aback, as if she hadn't expected such a direct response. But then her mask of indignation slipped back into place. "Well, maybe next time you'll think twice about bringing your issues onto a public flight," she retorted, her voice laced with venom. Her choice of words was deliberate, a final jab designed to wound. The cabin fell silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background as everyone waited to see how Marcus would respond. Would he lose his temper? Would he demand to speak to the captain? Or would he simply sit there and take it, like so many others might have done? Instead, Marcus did something unexpected. He smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that carried neither warmth nor humor. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down the spine of anyone who recognized it. Because it wasn't friendly, it was dangerous. "Let me clarify something for you," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though it carried effortlessly through the quiet cabin. "You've spent the last hour trying to provoke me, assuming I'm just another passenger you can intimidate, but here's the thing. You don't know who I am, and trust me, you don't want to find out." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The flight attendant froze, her confidence wavering for the first time. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Across the aisle, the young woman who had earlier glanced sympathetically at Marcus now stared wide-eyed, her hand clapped over her mouth. The older man 2 rows ahead muttered under his breath, "Oh boy, she's in trouble now." Marcus didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. His tone, his demeanor, the way he carried himself, all of it spoke volumes. For the first time since boarding the plane, the flight attendant seemed unsure of herself. She took a step back, her clipboard trembling slightly in her hands. I'll go check with the captain," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Without waiting for a response, she turned and hurried toward the front of the cabin, disappearing behind the curtain separating first class from economy. As soon as she was gone, the tension in the cabin began to dissipate. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering nervously while others openly gawked at Marcus. A businessman seated nearby leaned over and whispered, "Whatever you said, it worked." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he focused on Shadow, running a hand gently along the dog's back. Shadow looked up at him, his intelligent eyes reflecting the same calm resolve that defined his handler. Though the immediate threat had passed, Marcus knew this wasn't over. The flight attendant would likely return, either with reinforcements or a renewed determination to regain control of the situation. But Marcus wasn't worried. He had faced far worse adversaries than her, and he knew exactly how to handle people who underestimated him. The rest of the flight dragged on, punctuated by occasional murmurs from passengers speculating about what might happen next. Some admired Marcus's composure, while others wondered if the airline would side with the flight attendant. But Marcus didn't concern himself with their opinions. He had survived battles, endured hardships, and overcome obstacles that would break most people. This was just another challenge, one he was more than prepared to face. And as the plane soared higher into the sky, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the irony of the situation. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, being treated as a nuisance simply because of a dog. It was frustrating, yes, but also strangely validating. Because moments like these reminded him why he fought, not for recognition or glory, but for the belief that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Shadow rested his head on Marcus's foot, his breathing slow and steady. Together they waited, ready for whatever came next. Whatever it was, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The flight attendant returned sooner than Marcus expected, though her demeanor had shifted noticeably. She emerged from behind the curtain separating first class from economy, flanked by another crew member, a taller, older man who appeared to be the head of the cabin staff. The flight attendant's earlier bravado seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that was evident in the way she clutched her clipboard tightly against her chest. Her eyes darted toward Marcus briefly before dropping to the floor, as if she couldn't quite meet his gaze. The older man stepped forward, his expression calm but professional. "Sir," he began, addressing Marcus with a respectful nod, "I understand there's been some difficulty regarding your service dog. My colleague mentioned the situation, and I'd like to ensure everything is resolved properly." His tone was measured, diplomatic, clearly intended to diffuse any lingering tension. But Marcus wasn't about to let this slide without clarity. Not after what had transpired. "Difficulty?" Marcus repeated, his voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the polite veneer of the conversation. He leaned back slightly in his seat, his body language relaxed, yet commanding. Shadow remained at his side, alert but calm, his presence a silent testament to the absurdity of the entire ordeal. If by difficulty you mean your colleague kicking my dog and then spending the next hour trying to humiliate me in front of everyone on this plane, then yes, there has been some difficulty. The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the cabin. Passengers who had been feigning disinterest suddenly perked up, their attention riveted on the unfolding drama. A few gasped audibly, while others exchanged knowing glances. The older man blinked, clearly caught off guard by Marcus's directness. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, clearing his throat, the senior crew member attempted to regain control of the situation. "I see," he said slowly, glancing sidelong at the flight attendant, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. "That sounds unacceptable. If something like that occurred, it was entirely unintentional, I assure you. We hold ourselves to the highest standards of professionalism here." Marcus interrupted him with a single raised hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Unintentional," he echoed, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Let me clarify something for you both. When someone deliberately kicks a service animal, and then proceeds to call him a pet, a nuisance, and accuses me of being selfish for bringing him aboard, that's not unintentional. That's deliberate, and frankly, it's discriminatory." The word discriminatory hung in the air like a warning shot. The older man stiffened visibly, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of Marcus's accusation. He glanced, again at the flight attendant, who now looked as though she might melt into the carpet. "Sir," he said carefully, choosing his words with obvious caution, "if there was any wrongdoing, we will address it immediately. Please allow me to review the documentation for your service dog so we can resolve this matter swiftly." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the olive branch. Without saying a word, he retrieved the folder containing Shadow's official certification papers and handed them over. The older man accepted the documents, flipping through them quickly but thoroughly. As he read, his expression shifted from skepticism to genuine surprise. "This is impressive," he murmured, holding up one of the pages. "These credentials are legitimate. Top-tier training programs, medical endorsements, psychological evaluations. This isn't just a service dog. This is a highly specialized companion." The flight attendant made a small, strangled noise in the back of her throat, as if she wanted to protest but knew better than to speak. Her earlier confidence had crumbled completely, leaving her looking small and defeated. Marcus watched her reaction with detached curiosity. He didn't feel satisfaction or triumph, just a quiet sense of vindication. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about ensuring she understood the gravity of her actions. When the older man finished reviewing the documents, he turned back to Marcus, his tone markedly more respectful. "Sir, I apologize on behalf of our team. What happened here today does not reflect the values of this airline or its commitment to inclusivity. I assure you appropriate measures will be taken to prevent anything like this from happening again." Marcus inclined his head slightly, accepting the apology without comment. But he wasn't done yet. Not quite. "Thank you," he said evenly. "But I think it's important for everyone involved, including yourself, to fully grasp the significance of what's at stake here. Shadow isn't just a dog. He's part of my recovery plan, prescribed by doctors who understand the realities of PTSD. Every time someone dismisses him, or me, they're undermining years of progress. They're trivializing something that saves lives." His words resonated deeply, not just with the two crew members standing before him, but also with the passengers listening intently. The young woman across the aisle wiped away a tear, moved by the raw honesty in Marcus's voice. The businessman seated nearby gave a slow, approving nod, muttering under his breath, "Preach." Even the flight attendant, despite her obvious discomfort, seemed to shrink further into herself, as if realizing for the first time the magnitude of her mistake. The older man exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "You're absolutely right, sir. This is far more serious than we initially understood. On behalf of the airline, I want to extend our sincerest apologies. Not just for today's incident, but for any inconvenience caused. We'll be conducting an internal review to ensure this never happens again. Marcus studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity in his eyes. When he found it, he nodded once more. Good. Because awareness matters. People need to understand that service animals aren't luxuries, they're lifelines, and treating them or their handlers with disrespect isn't just rude, it's harmful. With that, the older man extended a hand which Marcus shook, firmly. The gesture felt symbolic, a quiet acknowledgement of accountability and mutual respect. As the two crew members retreated toward the front of the cabin, whispers erupted among the passengers. Some praised Marcus openly, calling him a hero, while others simply stared in awe, marveling at how poised and composed he had remained throughout the ordeal. But Marcus wasn't focused on the accolades. Instead, he turned his attention back to Shadow, scratching gently behind the dog's ears. "We did good, buddy," he murmured softly. Shadow responded with a soft whine, pressing closer to him, as if to say, "I've got your back." Together they sat in silence, the tension finally lifting like clouds dispersing after a storm. As the flight continued, the atmosphere on board shifted noticeably. Passengers who had previously avoided eye contact with Marcus now smiled warmly or offered quiet words of support. A teenager sitting a few rows ahead approached cautiously, holding out a folded piece of paper. Excuse me, sir?" he said hesitantly. Marcus looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah?" The boy held out, the paper revealing a hastily scrawled note. "Thank you for standing up for yourself. You're awesome." Marcus chuckled softly, touched by the gesture. "Thanks, kid," he replied, tucking the note into his pocket. "That means a lot." By the time the plane began its descent, the mood in the cabin had transformed entirely. What had started as a tense, divisive journey had ended with a shared sense of solidarity. Passengers disembarked one by one, many pausing to thank Marcus or wish him well. Even the flight attendant lingered near the exit, her face pale but sincere as she mumbled a final apology. Marcus accepted it graciously, offering her a curt nod. He didn't need to say anything else. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. As he stepped off the plane, Shadow trotting faithfully by his side, Marcus allowed himself a rare smile. The day hadn't gone as planned, but it had reminded him of something important. Standing up for yourself, and for others, matters. And sometimes, even in the most unexpected places, you find opportunities to make a difference. As Marcus stepped off the plane, the cool breeze of the terminal greeted him, carrying with it a sense of relief. Shadow walked beside him, his leash held firmly in Marcus's hand, his movements steady and confident. The chaos of the airport buzzed around them, travelers rushing to connecting flights, families reuniting after long separations, announcements echoing through the cavernous space. But Marcus felt strangely detached from it all. For the first time since boarding the flight, he allowed himself to exhale fully, letting go of the tension that had gripped him for hours. The walk toward baggage claim was quiet, almost meditative. Passengers who had been on the same flight occasionally slowed their pace to catch another glimpse of Marcus and Shadow. Some nodded respectfully, others smiled warmly, clearly still moved by what they had witnessed. A young mother with 2 children in tow stopped briefly to say, "Thank you for handling that so well. You're an inspiration." Her words were simple, but they carried weight, and Marcus offered her a small, grateful smile before continuing on his way. Despite the positive reactions, Marcus couldn't shake the lingering frustration from earlier. It wasn't just about the flight attendant or the confrontation. It was about the broader reality of living in a world where people like him often faced unnecessary hurdles. He thought about the countless times he'd been questioned, doubted, or dismissed because of Shadow's presence. Each incident chipped away at his patience, no matter how much he tried to remain composed. But today had been different. Today, he hadn't backed down. And in doing so, he had reminded not only the flight attendant but also everyone else on that plane of an important truth. Respect costs nothing, but its absence can carry a heavy price. Reaching the baggage carousel, Marcus leaned against a nearby railing, waiting for his suitcase to appear. Shadow sat obediently at his feet, his tail sweeping gently across the floor. Around them, conversations bubbled up. A group of college students laughing about their spring break adventures, a businessman on his phone discussing stock prices, an elderly couple reminiscing about their vacation. Life moved forward as it always did, but Marcus found himself reflecting on the events of the day. He thought about the irony of it all. Here he was, a man who had spent years protecting his country, facing hostility not from enemy combatants but from someone whose job was supposed to ensure safety and comfort for travelers. It was a stark reminder of how misplaced priorities could lead to unnecessary conflict. Yet despite the frustration, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. The passengers on the plane had seen something worth remembering, a lesson about empathy, understanding, and standing up for what's right. Perhaps some of them would carry that lesson into their own lives, sharing it with others and creating ripples of change. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a notification from social media. Someone on the plane must have recorded part of the altercation because a video clip had already gone viral. The caption read, "Flight attendant kicks service dog. Unaware owner is Delta Force commander." Below it, comments poured in by the thousands. Most were supportive, praising Marcus for his restraint and calling out the flight attendant's behavior. Others shared personal stories about their own experiences with service animals, expressing solidarity and gratitude for bringing attention to the issue. Marcus scrolled through the comments for a moment, his expression unreadable. On one hand, he appreciated the outpouring of support. It was heartening to see strangers rallying behind him and raising awareness about the importance of service animals. On the other hand, he disliked the spotlight. His life's work had always been about serving quietly without fanfare or recognition. Being thrust into the public eye, even unintentionally, felt uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. Shadow nudged his leg gently, snapping him out of his thoughts. Marcus glanced down, meeting the dog's intelligent gaze. "You hungry, buddy?" he asked, scratching behind Shadow's ears. Shadow wagged his tail enthusiastically and Marcus chuckled softly. No matter what happened, Shadow remained a constant source of joy and companionship. Together they navigated challenges big and small, always finding solace in each other's presence. Collecting his suitcase from the carousel, Marcus made his way toward the exit. As he approached the doors leading outside, a familiar voice called, "Out, Commander Kane." Turning, he spotted the older cabin crew member from the flight hurrying toward him. The man looked slightly out of breath, clutching a business card in his hand. "Sir," he said earnestly, stopping a few feet away, "I wanted to personally apologize again for today's incident. We take this very seriously, and I assure you, steps are being taken to prevent anything like this from happening in the future." Marcus studied him for a moment, noting the sincerity in his eyes. "Appreciate that," he replied simply. "It's not about me. It's about making sure people understand the value of service animals and treat them, and their handlers, with respect." The older man nodded vigorously. "Absolutely, sir. That's exactly why I'm here. If there's anything we can do to make this right, anything at all, please let us know." With that, he handed over the business card, which bore the logo of the airline along with a direct contact number. Marcus accepted it with a nod, slipping it into his pocket without comment. As the man walked away, Marcus stepped outside, where the fresh air greeted him like an old friend. The parking lot stretched out before him, rows of cars glinting under the late afternoon sun. He located his vehicle quickly, loading his suitcase into the trunk before opening the back door for Shadow. The dog jumped in eagerly, circling once before settling onto the blanket Marcus kept there for him. Closing the door, Marcus slid into the driver's seat, resting his hands on the steering wheel for a moment. For the first time all day, he allowed himself to truly relax. The confrontation on the plane felt distant now, like a chapter closing in a larger story. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. There always were. But he also knew he had faced worse and come out stronger. What mattered most was staying true to himself, even when the world tried to push him off course. Starting the car, Marcus pulled out of the parking lot, merging onto the highway. Shadow rested quietly in the back seat, his head resting on his paws. The drive home was peaceful, the hum of the engine blending with the soft sounds of Shadow's breathing. Outside, the landscape rolled by, fields stretching endlessly, dotted, with trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was a reminder of how vast and beautiful the world could be, even amid its imperfections. When Marcus finally arrived home, he parked in the driveway and turned off the engine. Stepping out, he stretched, feeling the tension leave his body completely. Shadow bounded out of the car, tail wagging furiously as he sniffed the familiar surroundings. Marcus smiled, watching him for a moment before retrieving his suitcase and heading inside. His house was modest but comfortable, filled with reminders of the life he had built for himself. Photos of friends and family lined the walls alongside, medals and awards earned during his military career. They weren't displayed proudly, more like tucked away, visible only if you looked closely. Marcus preferred it that way. To him, the real measure of success wasn't in accolades or recognition, but in the quiet moments of peace and connection. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Marcus sat on the porch with Shadow, lying at his feet. The dog's head rested on Marcus's lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. Together, they watched the sky transform into shades of orange and pink, the colors blending seamlessly like paint on a canvas. Reflecting on the day's events, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Shadow, but for the lessons he had learned along the way. Standing up for himself hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, and while he couldn't control how others behaved, he could choose how he responded. In doing so, he had reminded himself, and hopefully others, that dignity, resilience, and compassion are qualities worth fighting for. As darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Marcus leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, but for now he was content to sit in silence, surrounded by the quiet strength of the bond he shared with Shadow. Because sometimes, the simplest things, the loyalty of a dog, the beauty of a sunset, the peace of home, are enough to remind you that life, despite its flaws, is still worth living.